Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Two Trees podcast. Our conference Beyond the Gates of Eden continues with Mike Chu. Chat with Chu. Here we go. He has unloaded his personal repertoire of amazing facts about the tree of life. And he really took you from the book of Genesis all the way through the book of Revelation, which is no small feat to do in an hour and a little bit, Mike. So I know that was kind of a whirlwind tour of the idea of the tree of life. And just wanted to say, first of all, it was awesome. You did a fantastic job. And I don't know how much time you put into your slides and your artwork, but man, way to go. Two thumbs way, way up.
Thank you.
I
Appreciate that.
I was impressed, and I loved the idea of tracing that theme from its beginning to its ending and viewing the Bible as one consistent piece of God's art, really, which kind of came across, at least to me, as we took a look at the river of Scripture. I have a list of questions, Mike. None of them are crazy hard unless you don't know the answer, and then they will be very hard. Some of them I wouldn't want to answer, but I know you and you'll do awesome. So, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about early in the lecture, you talked about what is culture. And you
Mm.
used the expression of discussing culture like a river. Um, how much of that river swept along Israel? Should we be thinking of them as mildly influenced by this river, or and I think the questioner has the idea of, as a person today, how much should I be letting the culture around me shape the way that we perform art, or that we draw, or that we write? Talk a little bit about where this concept of a cultural river comes from.
I would say the idea of the cultural river, that definitely was an attribution from John Walton. He was the first one I read who actually brought up that idea of essentially, using the metaphor of a river. You have two choices with a river if you are in it. You can either swim along the current and use the energy from the current of that river to propel you along, or you have the option of swimming against it. So then you're applying energy to try to counteract the force of the river that's being pushed upon you. And actually, there's a third option. You can also go perpendicular to it to try to get to shore, right? And so the idea of a cultural river, it was such a powerful metaphor that that's partly why I used it, because in many ways, culture is all around us. The zygus, right? Is like the spirit of the air, or the air that we're breathing. That is essentially the culture. And I know that people are sometimes they're uneasy about the concept that the Israelites and other folks were incorporating ideas or symbology or metaphors from the broader culture. But I think we do the same thing all the time, but we are also not aware of like where are our cultural touchstones coming from, right? For example, I don't understand why do we call the final football game between two teams in the NFL, why do we call it a Super Bowl? I know there are probably going to be some geeks and nerds who know that answer, but I don't. But
Yeah,
culturally, it's so ubiquitous in our society that even if you don't watch football for most of the year, probably you'll at least tune in to at least watch the commercials of the Super Bowl. It's a
right.
cultural event. It's probably one of the few cultural events that still most people will engage with, right, in Western society right now. And so I think it's a little I think it's helpful for us to acknowledge that the Israelites themselves interacted with people who are not Israelites.
Right.
Right? And that even the fact that their language, Hebrew, is called a Semitic language, meaning it's coming from a family of other cousin languages that had a common root. And language is always affected by culture, right?
Mm.
We always employ some sort of metaphor, symbology, similes. ideas that we're communicating with one another. And especially if there are similar languages or cousin languages with one another, you got culture baked in right into the very words you're using. And so I don't find there's a way for us to ever avoid the reality that culture is going to be a part of our actual study of the scriptures.
So, Mike, where I live at, there's a very strong Anabaptist culture
Mhm.
is the dominant, and so it's not uncommon to see horses and buggies,
Mm.
people in plain clothes, and I know that's probably not the case in Boston, but I'm just making assumptions because I have never been to Boston. But in all the TV I have watched, I have not seen any Boston Amish or anything like that. Uh, so for people who live around me or that are members of my church, this is more than just a hypothetical.
Mm.
They've grown up in the idea that the world's culture is an evil to be
Mm.
avoided. What markers would you, as I'm going to ask you to put your pastor hat on here for just a second. Um, how do we know when we're getting too deep into the culture of the world and we're no longer being a distinct people? Does it have to do with the way that we dress? Should we all be wearing broad brim hats and cheering for the same team? Like, what's the role of diversity within the church as seen through the framework of what you're talking about?
I think I understand the concern that folks may have or just viewing culture as though it's an evil. And some of that I think does have to do with, I mean, like you mentioned, I'm in Boston. And the way that we evangelicals here in Boston generally talk about the culture that surrounds us in our region is that not only is it postmodern, it is also post-Christian. It is thoroughly post-Christian. So it is not generally very favorable towards um, expressions of faith, at least evangelical Protestant faith. If it may be a little different with Roman Catholicism, that's a little bit more embedded, and part of it is also, ironically, culturally baked into major demographics within the city of and the region of Boston, right? Either you're Italian or you're Irish, you most likely then came from a Catholic practicing family, maybe. Maybe
Sure.
maybe nominally Catholic. You went to church on Christmas and Easter. But at the very least, you grew up with some sense of a Christian culture. For many others who are not from that kind of background, many of them have been not just nuns, they grew up in families of nuns, right? The nuns, they had no religion. They were agnostic. They didn't go to church. They didn't do that. They did Sunday brunch. They mowed the
Yeah.
lawn. They didn't know anything else about God or anything else like that. So I understand it's a very easy thing to then view the secular culture as though it's an evil. I would push back in that ultimately the very beginnings of the church was a culture that was either indifferent or antagonistic towards the Christian faith, not even just the Christian faith, even the Jewish faith, right? Of just why is it the Jewish people get the special exemption of
Right.
having to honor Caesar and worship him? You know, that kind of deal. And so you already have that moment where the church could just say, well, we just need to just stay within ourselves, protect our own walls, and not ever really talk with anyone or interact with anyone else who's not from our culture, the Christian culture, the godly culture. Uh, but that isn't what the Great Commission is. The Great Commission is to try to build bridges and actually convey the proclamation that Jesus is King, that the
Right.
kingdom of God is here, that salvation is at hand, that lay down your allegiances to Caesar or whoever you have given your loyalties to and follow after the one true King and creator of all life. Like that's the message. That is the
Right.
heralding that we are supposed to be doing. And I was actually talking about this with my lead pastor earlier this week. One of the coolest things that I learned in my last year at Gordon Conwell was about the Eastern Church, and I just say that in a very broad sense, the Eastern part of the church in the early centuries of the church movement, and that their impetus was every time they went in, one, they kept on sending missionaries, right? So the Eastern Orthodox Church, Oriental Orthodox, the Church of the East, they kept on saying missionaries further and further east. And every time they hit a new region, they would want to proclaim the gospel. And they would want to also find a way to translate the scriptures that they had into the language of the people they encountered so that people can also read about the story of creation and of God and of Jesus.
Right.
And they even went to the point of, oh, you guys don't have an actual written language? No problem. We'll use our Greek alphabet and make up a written language using your sounds so that you will have a written language. Like, because we need you to read the Bible and we want you to learn about this God and King that we follow. Like that was their impetus. They engaged with the culture and more so, they even engaged with the language to even go to the point of let's create a written language for you guys. You never had one. You never thought you needed one, but you need one now because you need to know about the story. And
Beautiful.
it's a beautiful thing of like, wow. And it was really was the Eastern Church that sent the first Christian missionaries into China. That at the very least, the earliest records that we have shows at least a confirmation that the Christian message started showing up in China itself around the 5th century, if not earlier.
Wow.
Because by the time that they sent the Church of the East sent essentially missionaries or administration folks to China to help establish and take care of the churches that were there, the Christians that were there. That implies that Christians were already in China at least before the 5th century. How early, we
Right.
don't know yet. But I would like to think that as people kept going further and further out, they kept engaging with culture. And instead of shirking away or being cautious or fearful of it, they engaged with it and tried to find what was actually redeemable
Right.
and understandable and build bridges with the gospel using those elements.
I think
And
that's huge. I think that's such a big idea that the church today, at least here, the default mode is isolation. And I
it,
feel like the gospel of Christ is made for much more than isolation. It conquers, it flavors, it is a power and not just something to be shared comfortably amongst you and yours, but the kind of thing that the church should be seeking creative ways, like inventing a new language or speaking in ways that are culturally relevant without changing the core of what we are to communicate clearly is a powerful part of the commission.
I think there's also maybe something because we're talking in particularly an American Western experience and you're talking about like Anabaptists and that kind of culture and that experience. I think a lot of it also has to do with us as Western Christians. A lot of our history, we were power players within Western civilization, right? We had a very vocal and very influential voice. And for some of that, that was legitimate. That was actually like, okay, that was well earned, right? You would look at priests and you would honor the fact that they gave up so much in order to serve the communities, the parishes that they took care of, right? There was some legitimacy to it. But there is also the fact that we, unfortunately, in the Western church had gotten so used to also political and forceful power.
Right.
And now that that has been essentially mostly gone, especially in certain regions like my area, um, it can feel threatening all of a sudden. Like now we don't have the protection of worldly power, of secular influence. We don't have the respectability anymore. And it's much easier then to just kind of look inward and close off.
Right.
And there is a danger in that, right? The gospel had gone as far as China, and it even had gone into Japan. And one of the unfortunate things I remember learning years ago was that the Japanese Christians, especially through their intense persecutions, many of them died. Many of them were martyred. But there was a contingent of them that essentially went underground. And underground meaning they completely closed themselves off from the rest of society in Japan. They destroyed all of their books, including their Bibles. They got rid of anything that was written that could implicate them as Christian. and they taught and passed on their faith very quietly from one generation to the other. That group still exists, but when you meet with them, their practices are very distinctly Christian. They will do communion, the Eucharist. They will even baptize, but they don't understand why
Right.
anymore. Like that essentially they are still practicing, but they don't know what they are doing. They don't know who it's for. They just know that this is just something that my parents did and what my grandparents did and what their great great grandparents did. And but they don't understand the reasons why. And that's kind of what happened when that community of Christians closed themselves off out of fear and essentially lost the whole entire story, lost the script of what they were actually meant to be and do. Even if it meant, yes, the loss of their lives here and now. But they saved their own lives, but in the end, they don't even know who they are anymore.
Right.
And
Let
I
me
think
ask,
that's an extreme example, but
but that's
I would
history. Yeah.
that's history. Yeah.
So this question kind of goes along with that. When we get to the book of Revelation, Mike, you made a beautiful description of the fact of the trees, uh, talking about them not just as a tree, but as like lining the streets, and that the fruit is for the healing of the nations.
Mhm.
Can you expand a little bit about what you think that means? Does it just mean that Christians are nice and we make the world sweeter? Like, is it like being salt and light? What do you think is implied in the reference that the fruit is for the healing of the nations?
Well, like let's break it down, right? The word nations, this isn't necessarily talking about a governmental system. It's about the ethnic groups.
Right,
That's essentially at the core. When you see the word nations in English, especially in the New Testament, most of the time it's actually talking about not a governmental system. It's talking about people groups, ethnicities.
right,
And so I think that's something that we have to kind of reckon with, that when we see that, it's talking about assuming that the people groups, the ethnicities that are going to be at the end of the eschaton, at that moment, healing is still necessary. And yet we're at the end of all things, but there are things that still need to be healed. Why? And so I think that it does imply there's a lot of reconciliation, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of things that we as human beings, as we divided up into different ethnicities, we have inflicted upon one another.
right.
And you know, I do find that the picture and the beauty about the end of Revelation is that yes, it is one giant family of God. That is the vision that was in the beginning in Eden, and we finally get back to it. And yet there is no glossing over the reality, however, that the nations, the people groups are all there. We are all going to be given the robes that have been dipped in the blood of the Lamb.
Right.
And as I often have said many years, ever since even my young teenage years as a Christian, that in the end, we're all going to be blood related, not because of our own DNA to one another, but because we are all related to one another by the blood of the Lamb.
I
That
like
is
that.
the one blood that is connecting all of us together. But let's be honest that in the end of all this, there is going to be healing. There has to be healing between even just the simple divide here in the US between Caucasian, African American, Asian, even within Asian, Chinese to Korean, Korean to Japanese, and even that group towards Southeastern Asians like Indonesians, Filipinos, Vietnamese. Like you got a lot of healing and reckoning of acknowledging the hurts that we have all inflicted towards one another in some form or fashion.
Do you see a connection between Pentecost and the unbabble that takes place at the beginning of the church and this healing of the nations that seems to be in view in the trees?
I think there is something, I mean, I don't know if there's a direct link, but I think it is following along in the theme of what's happening, right? Because Pentecost is a reversal of what happened at Babel. It's reunifying the humanity that was broken up and split into different groupings because of the actions of what was happening in the tower. And so there is that reversal that's happening. The tree, I think ultimately it's part of the reversal towards death because the very the assumption that we often make, right? I assumed this as a young Christian, that when Adam and his wife were created, they were by default immortal. It never occurred to me that their access to the tree of life in the center of the garden was actually part of why they could be immortal.
Right.
And that losing that access without being able to consume from the tree of life, yeah, you're not going to live forever. You will
Mm.
die. That is pretty much you are guaranteed to die because they're not allowed to come back to that tree. And it's a very kind of sobering reality that you know many times whenever I've ever taught or took a small group going through the book of Genesis, especially chapter 3, I remember one incident. It was a very interesting moment where everyone in the group got really fixated on why did God put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the center of the garden? Like they got so fixated by that. And then I asked, was there anything else in the center of the garden? And it's the tree of life.
Yeah.
But our eyes immediately went into text to the
To the
tree of the
negative.
knowledge of good and evil
Wow.
and not to the tree of life. And the realization is they could have eaten from the tree of life. That was part of the whole entire eat of every tree, eat of every fruit of every tree here, except one, right?
Right.
The emphasis in the Hebrew is you are free. You are so free to eat
Mm.
from every
Mhm.
tree here. Just don't eat that one because that will kill you. And so like it's not even that he was trying to put the temptation in front of them first. It was actually a message of the thrust of that message was you are free. You have freedom. Will you exercise that freedom in wisdom?
Mm.
Or will you go for something that I'm warning you, don't eat from that because it will kill you?
That's actually one of the questions that came up today that came in is about contingent immortality. You know, that
Mm.
God asked them to leave, and he says, so that they cannot eat from the tree of
Yeah.
life. Um, do you think they were eating from the tree of life already? Just a
I mean,
Mike Chu opinion.
I don't think they felt a need yet. But at the same time, right, that's cautionary about Genesis 2 and 3 as time is compressed.
Yeah.
We have no idea how much time went by. We have no idea if Adam and his wife started acting like a husband and wife. We don't know. I would imagine they didn't. And I would imagine as well that unfortunately, Adam, I don't know, I sometimes get worked up about the image I remember seeing when I was working on a sermon for Genesis 3. There was an image where someone created this picture of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, and you have the serpent is like curled around the tree. It's all like silhouettes. And you
Hmm.
see the woman reaching for the fruit, but on the other side of the picture, like so she's on the right and on the far left, on the other side of the picture is Adam. And they're basically implying the man was nowhere near this conversation that was happening.
Right.
And yet she could easily, according to the text, hand it to him.
Turned. Yeah.
Now, I mean, yes, you could possibly say that picture is valid because, maybe it's just didn't describe that she ran over to him, like a 2-minute jog to give him the fruit. But I find it unlikely.
Yeah.
I think that the Occam's razor solution is probably the best interpretation. Adam was listening. He just didn't say a thing. He knew the words. He knew the prohibition. He knew what was the consequence, and he didn't say a thing. And I find that disturbing.
Do you see connections to that to the church today?
How so?
Just the not saying anything. Like if we are isolating, or like you brought up the illustration of those Christians who had kind of left the scriptures behind but kept the forms,
Mm.
we're doing this just because. The idea of, well, Adam did it, but really it's Eve's fault. Like the whole concept of finger pointing. Uh, kind of doesn't really help us at all. We have to be saying something. There needs to be a voice, not just an isolation, if we are going to have not ultimate healing between the nations, but the church needs to be part of making unity even now.
I would say that's a good application of it. I think also, I mean, the whole incident about it's that incident in Genesis 3 is a portrayal of both male and female failing,
Yeah,
disobeying. They both engaged in the disobedience. Now, the woman's disobedience was probably more from trickery and foolishness, right? I mean, when you look at the text between the conversation between the serpent and the woman, it's very interesting of how he starts off this wily serpent starts off with, did he really say that? And then
right.
she goes in. And I personally do find it significant that there seems to be an addition to the actual quotation. And it just kind of snowballs from there. And yet it is still in the end, they both only realized they were naked once both the woman and Adam finish eating. And then it seems like the scales fell off.
Yeah,
And so that would imply to me the failure of humanity is not on one gender or one sex. It is both. It
yes,
is both failures in different ways, but it is a complete disobedience. It's not a laying down of allegiance to Yahweh, the creator, trusting that, hey, he said not to eat this because we'll die. Let's trust that. and and no, like, yeah, it looks pretty and all, but we're good. We got 999 other fruit trees to try out. This is not the only one that we have to eat from.
yeah,
So, but I do think there is something to be said about when the church or when the people of God are silent, when there is wrong or temptation of wrong that is being proposed. Um, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing then.
right. Another question that came in that kind of goes along that same element, at least within the narrative of scripture, is this person said, would you please ask Mike to talk a little bit about the connection between the breath of life and the tree of life? I have never thought about these two things before. Um, do they go together, Mike? What is it just a literary tool that's being used, or is it a way of pointing to the Father? What's going on there with the similarity in the phrases?
I think there's the connection is that it is doing a connecting back to, well, who's the source of all that? Who is the source of life? And so there is, and actually that is why I found it very interesting as I did the research that the tree over time, even the very fact that the tree gets a cherubim to to guard it, and later on in the second
With
temple
scythed
material.
chariots. I have never thought about that before, but it's a cool image.
Well, yeah, if you look it up on Google Image and stuff like that, it's like, holy cow, that is a deadly weapon. Um,
I need some
and
artists out there to make that for me. I need to see that.
yeah, yeah, you could totally find it. What's interesting is that, for some of my friends I know, they would be very disturbed by, what do you mean this is probably from an image of like a Persian chariot? It's like, well, probably because Genesis was finished and compiled together around the Babylonian exile. That would bother some people. Um, so we'll skip that part. But I would
Okay.
say that the tree of life, breath of life, there is that illusion because in the grammar itself, it's implying, well, what can this thing do for you? Right? What does this breath do for you? It gives you life. What can this tree do for you? It gives you life. Like the way that the genitive of it works in the grammar, I think there is that conveying of that message. Well, where is this life coming from? Is it just like autonomous on its own, or is it coming? Where is this life coming? Who's the one who actually just created the life, right? And more interestingly enough, is that the very breath of life, that was something that God gave, breathed into Adam. So it was not even just like, like he just blew it out to the general air and hope it just lands on Adam. It was actually purposely focused and breathed into him.
And
And
that's kind of
so,
what fruit is, isn't it? We're to ingest this. It's designed for
yeah,
consumption.
yeah. I mean, it's that's what I mean is like that the as we talk about it, more and more interesting it becomes because the way that the Second Temple writers were thinking about it, by the time it evolved into their time period, the tree of life and the throne of God essentially became one and the same.
Mm,
They're both protected by the cherubim. They're both protected by essentially the throne guardians. And well,
right.
who sits on the throne?
The Most High.
The
Yeah.
Most High. And so like like it's almost like, wait, so if the tree and the throne are like just conflated with one another in these visions and these descriptions, huh? So the tree of life is is a throne for the
Mm.
creator. So
Well,
thus when
let's
you eat from it,
Yeah, let's pursue that thought just a little bit because in your lecture, you did a really cool job of talking about how the word that's used for cross in Koine Greek
mm,
has that same idea as dead wood.
oh
And
yeah.
in the Old Testament, you have eitz, that Hebrew word that just kind of means things made out of tree. Uh, the seeing the cross as the tree of life or as the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is it both? Walk us through a little bit about how you would think about that yourself.
Well, I think we have to be careful, right? Because the use of the word, and this is why it's a debatable thing amongst New Testament scholars, especially those who are looking at Revelation. The question is, well, how well do you think the New Testament writers understood Greek? I think that ultimately would come down to like where do you fall on that spectrum? Do you think they knew enough so that it was functional, or did they know enough that they could be clever? And I would think I lean towards that they were clever. I think there was something going on with it because in Greek, there's so many different words for tree. In Hebrew, you get one or two. Heck, when we get to like the burning bush, it's actually the same word. It's for tree, but it's a small tree. It's
That's enough.
yeah. It's so you don't have as much like vocabulary range in Hebrew when you're talking about things made of wood or like living wood or things that were that wood came from, which would be from trees. So you got that. But once you get into Greek, there are many different versions of wood because you got the living wood, you got bark, you got dead wood, you got driftwood. And so it's very interesting that the writers, when they are talking about the cross, they use the word tree, but they're talking about dead wood. And you could say, well, technically, isn't the cross made from dead wood? So there's always those kind of arguments, but I find it very fascinating that it is that the word in Revelation, and I think the writer at least knows enough Greek to know that, well, this is the tree of life. I'm obviously calling back to Ezekiel. I'm obviously calling back to Genesis 2. So why won't I use the word that implies a living tree, like an oak tree that is still planted and bearing out acorns. Why not use those kind of words? Why did I decide to go ahead and use this word that's typically associated with driftwood, with
Hmm.
deadwood? Unless there is something going on with what this writer is thinking. That the thing that was meant
Yeah.
to be an instrument of death, that itself was dead, became the very instrument of life for all of those who follow this king.
Preach, brother. I'm on it. I think I want to hear the Mike Chu sermon on this. I need like a full episode just on this idea. It is right. You are speaking straight to my heart. Do you have time for one or two more? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. This one comes from the idea of and this one I know you're going to be super familiar with, but this reader was a little confused by the phrase already, but not yet, when you
Uh,
pulled that out there. Would you unpack that phrase a little bit for them?
so the already, but not yet. Other authors have been using different phrasing, such as like Dr. Michael Bird, he'll say the now and not yet, and very different variations. What it essentially is, I'm trying to remember, but I can't, it's slipping my name. It was developed by a biblical scholar in the 19th century. He was the first one to coin this idea. It essentially is when you're looking at eschatology and you're looking at how, how will things end up? How will the eschaton, the consummation end up? And the typical way people always thought about it in the past was, well, we're still waiting. We're still waiting for all the stuff to start working out. We're still waiting for the kingdom to be here. We're still waiting for new life. We're still waiting for the day of the Lord. And he realized, and he started doing this kind of this study and careful viewing of the language within the New Testament about, it seems to be that we're living in the kingdom now. And probably one of the most prominent moments is when you look in the book, in the Gospel of Mark, which a lot of scholars believe is the first gospel, the first written down gospel, that Mark was the one who essentially pioneered this new format of communicating, a royal biography and related to Jesus. That when Jesus is baptized, the way that the whole entire scene of the Father speaking from heaven, the Matthew and Luke, Matthew would use a word like the sky was open, like as though like a door was open. The way what Mark used instead was more violent. It was a word that implies essentially the tearing of a fabric or a tearing of a veil. And that this kind of tear is not mendable. And so what's interesting is that it seems to imply that the divide between heaven and earth, a tear has been made, and it's not ever going to get closed again. And it was at the baptism of Jesus that the kingdom of God started at that moment. When he was baptized, it was the beginning moment of the kingdom. And so, if that is the implication of what Mark was trying to say, then would it not make sense then? So, the kingdom is here, the kingdom is pouring in, but why is everything happening like as though it's still not here yet? That we still experience moments when it doesn't feel like the kingdom is fully here. Jesus has not fully returned yet. And yet we have the Spirit with us.
Right.
We have healing that is going on between reconciliation, between family members, even between people of different ethnicities. Healing that's happening.
Right.
So like how do we explain this? And so eventually this concept of the already and not yet was developed, where it was this living that we are actually living in the midst of the eschaton.
Right.
That the eschaton is actually here and now, and it's in process. I think there's part of the fallacy sometimes as Westerners, we tend to like very strong like subdivisions and like very clear markers of, okay, this started, this ended. We don't realize that really for the last 2,000 years, the church has been in the midst of in progress right now in the eschaton. That's what already and not yet is simply is applying. Other folks who've been diving more into those kind of thoughts would be folks like Michael Bird, N.T. Wright. I would highly recommend those kind of readings and books to check out because it's very freeing to realize that the promise of the consummation of finally the creation, new creation is coming upon us. We're not waiting. We are actually are in the midst of it, and we're actually part of that process. Can't hear you, John.
It's because I muted myself because my dog was going nuts.
No
I heard
worries.
it for the first time from Dr. Heiser.
Ah,
Uh, and This was the first time I was introduced to it. And to me, the part of scripture that just came flooding into my mind was the Lord's Prayer.
mm,
Lord, I'm praying that your kingdom,
yes.
your will would be done here as it is
Mm,
in heaven. And so when
yeah.
Christ cries from the cross, it is finished. It is done, and yet it's not done. It is present and it is coming, that which was and is yet to come. I think it's a beautiful phrase and it's enriched my thinking a lot.
I think, and we as even as Western like evangelicals, we don't realize that we actually are incorporating, we have incorporated some of that kind of thinking in our theology, our doctrine, without even realizing it, right? Because
Right.
we'll have the whole entire, I'm justified, I'm being sanctified, and I'm going to be glorified. And yet all three of those are essentially talking about salvation.
Yeah.
And that salvation is, yes, you were saved. You are being saved right now. Thank God for the Spirit. And we will be saved. And that's the glorification that we're looking forward to. Eastern Christians generally they would just describe all that as you're in the process of theosis. You're in the process of uniting yourself in the process of experiencing the divine community that is the Trinity. That the life that is found within the Trinity amongst the members, we are now invited to that same life because Jesus took upon himself, God the Son took upon himself humanity. And,
Well,
you know, uh, this was a thought that I had like years ago. Someone had pointed it out. I never took it seriously until this friend said it. Yes, God is timeless. He is the timeless one. He is the eternal one. And yet the most interesting thing about God the Son is that as he became in the flesh, he tied himself to time
right.
like us. And since what one member of the Trinity experiences, the other members will experience the same. That this creator God of ours, who is timeless, who was, is, and is to come, and yet they agreed to tie themselves to time like we are now. And that to me, I mean, it blows my mind. They did not have to do that. God the Son did not have to tie himself to the limits of time, and yet
Well,
he did.
I think I'm going to land our plane here, Mike. And this is a question from me. And just as a pastor, as someone in ministry, and someone who's just been really blessed by your heart and your love of Scripture and your passion for education and sharing the gifts and the knowledge that God has given to you with the rest of us. Um, when I approached you with this idea of talking about something Eden-ish, I left it really vague. And you came out swinging with this idea, like almost right away. I don't know if you remember that or not, but I do. And it was pretty quick that you were decided this would be a cool thing to talk about. And you have given a really great presentation. What are your hopes that the people who have listened to it will do with the lecture? Now that you've presented it and it lives online, what do you want them to do?
I think one of the part of why it came out of me so quickly was because the tree of life has always been a very intriguing thing for me, and especially Psalm 1. And I had always had a sneaking suspicion that somehow, the blessed man of Psalm 1 is connected to, or at least echoing something about the tree of life.
Right.
And I I personally like, yes, I would technically, on one level, Psalm 1 is connected to the ultimate blessed man, the Messiah. I think Psalm 1 and 2 are talking about the Messiah. But then ultimately, also, Psalm 1 is also speaking to all of the followers of this Messiah, that we are to emulate our master, our king. Right? And so the tree of life having all these implications about it was part of our original, it was there during our original creation. The fact that trees are connected to the fact that we were also part of the land creation of Genesis 1. Like there's this interesting linkage between us and trees, or just really just the land, and then how it shows up at the end that here we are back in Eden. We are back in a recreated, a renewed version of Eden.
Right.
And the healing of the nations, I mean, it implies to me that this is not a passive thing, that this is actually a very actively engaged thing. I think the
Right.
implication is that if we are meant to be like the tree of life, or to be like at least the Psalm 1, the blessed man or woman who will yield their fruit in season, that means it's the works of our lives as these trees that are planted by the source of life, by the streams of water. What are we doing that can provide life to those around us, that can actually bring healing to those around us? I think those are the implications. And that's something I think that is something that folks I would encourage you to sit with. I don't know what everyone's situation or circumstance is. What I do know, at least for my circumstance, is that my ingestion of the scriptures, my practice of my discipline in Christian life, it is to be a blessing to others so that others would be blessed. And that can be from the smallest moments, such as sitting in a waiting room, waiting for my wife's surgery to finish, and seeing another woman who is completely scared and wondering if her husband will survive the surgery that he's in, and taking time to just talk with her and share with her about what we had experienced and pray with her, even though she hadn't prayed for decades. Right. And so I think that is part of what our vocation is in this world. And that if one day we are meant to be like those trees of life along the sides of the river of life, and the fruit and the leaves are used for the healing of the nations, it's exciting. Of like the implication of just absorbing that metaphor, and what does it mean then for me to actually reach out and to be an influence around those who I encounter.
Mike, I
So,
can't thank you enough for giving up so much time for the creation of this study and then coming on to answer the questions that folks had for you. Um, Go ahead and, if you don't mind, you guys may not know this, but Mike is the host of many podcasts. He is the most podcasty of men I know. Where can they go to get more Mike Chu?
well, I am a co-host on the Divine Council Worldview podcast with Dr. Ron Johnson. It's a project that's part of the Michael S. Heiser Foundation. I think we're around now 70 something odd episodes. We're going through the book of John currently. And so, yeah, folks can find me and Ron there as we just basically geek out reading the scriptures together. The other podcast that I co-host this is for the school that I work for, the Awakening School of Theology. That was started by also Dr. Heiser. And what we do with that is we have a reading community who's been reading through all of the scriptures from the Old Testament, and we're getting ready to get into the New Testament soon. And so what we do every month is, as people are reading through those books of the month, we ask them, hey, send us your questions. And we'll garner all those questions together and then try to find a biblical scholar whose expertise is in that particular book. And we ask those questions, and that scholar and I will have a conversation back and forth about that question. And so those are the two main podcasts that I help out with. And it's been a really cool journey for the last 2.5 odd years doing this.
Well, it is a blessing to me, and I know it's a blessing to others. So, Mike, thank you so much for being here with us. And to all of you guys out there watching the live stream. I'm praying that God blesses you and that you are like those trees.